The silence of the high desert isn't peaceful, it is heavy. It presses down on a man, testing the structural integrity of his sanity. For Hollis Vane, that silence had been his only companion for 3 months. 3 months since the drought turned his soil into gray dust. 3 months since he had spoken a word to another living soul. He stood in the doorway of his failing ranch, a man carved from exhaustion and grit. He had nothing left. The barns were empty, the larder was bare, and hope was a currency that had long since devalued to nothing. He possessed only one thing of value, one final lifeline that stood between him and the abyss. A chestnut mare, strong, reliable, his only means of escape when the inevitable end finally came. But that evening, as the sun bled crimson across the western horizon, Hollis did the unthinkable. 2 figures had appeared at the edge of his property, Apache women, sisters. They didn't speak, they didn't beg, they simply stood there, radiating a desperate, silent plea. The younger one leaned heavily on the older, blood darkening the fabric of her skirt around her leg. They were exhausted, hunted, and entirely out of options. Hollis looked at the horse, his ticket out. He looked at the sisters, their eyes hollow with the expectation of rejection. In a world governed by survival of the fittest, the rational choice was clear. You keep the horse, you survive. Hollis Vane broke the rules. Without a word, he unfastened the reins and held them out. The older sister stared at him, bewildered, as if he had handed her a loaded gun barrel first. But she took them. She helped her sister mount, and they vanished into the deepening twilight, leaving Hollis alone with his choice and the crushing silence. He thought that was the end of it. He was wrong. Scene. The horizon changes narrator. Dawn didn't bring light. It brought judgment. Hollis woke to a sound that wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency rumble that vibrated in his chest. He walked to the porch, coffee cup in hand, and looked east. The horizon, usually empty and flat, had changed texture. It was moving. Dust rose like a storm front, but this storm had intent. As the shapes resolved, Hollis realized his mistake. It wasn't a storm. It was an army. 200 warriors. They rode in a formation that spoke of discipline and lethal purpose. They weren't raiding, they were marching, and they were heading straight for him. Hollis didn't run. There was nowhere to go. He didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the doorframe. What use was 1 bullet against 200? He simply stood there, his hands loose by his sides, and waited for the consequences of his mercy. They slowed as they reached the perimeter of his land. The thunder of hooves, transitioning into the terrifying heavy breathing of 200 horses. They encircled the house, a wall of muscle and leather and iron. Then, the formation parted. A single rider approached. He was a man who occupied space with the gravity of a mountain, Nahali. His face was a map of scars and hard-won survival. His hair streaked with iron gray. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man about to solve a problem. He dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the dust with a heavy thud. He walked until he was standing 3 feet from Hollis. Close, enough for the rancher to see the flecks of gold in the warrior's dark eyes. You gave them the horse, Nahali said. It wasn't a question. His voice was gravel grinding on stone, his English precise. Hollis nodded, his throat dry. Yes, you knew who they were. I knew they needed help. Nahali studied him, his gaze piercing. You knew that horse was your last. You knew that without it, you were stranded. You gave away your life for strangers. Why? Hollis struggled to find the words. How do you explain that sometimes? Looking into the eyes of someone who has lost everything reminds you that you still have something to give. They were being hunted, Hollis said simply. The girl was bleeding. I couldn't watch them die. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. The 200 warriors watched, motionless statues waiting for a signal. My daughters told me, Nahali said, his voice lowering. 3 men tracking them. If they had been on foot, they would be dead. You didn't just give them a horse, rancher. You bought their lives with your own. Hollis exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Is she... ... Is the girl all right? For the first time, the mask slipped. A flicker of something human passed behind Nahali's eyes. She is alive because of you. He stepped back, and his hand moved to his belt. Hollis flinched, expecting a weapon. And instead, Nahali pulled out a strip of braided leather. You have made a powerful enemy, rancher. The men hunting my daughters? They were not bandits. They were professionals. And they know where the horse came from. They're coming here. Their reality hit Hollis like a physical blow. The act of kindness hadn't just cost him a horse. It had painted a target on his back. Come, Nahali commanded. You cannot stay here. If they find you, they will make you speak before they kill you. Go with you. Hollis looked at the war party. Or to safety, or to war, whichever comes first. The journey was a blur of heat and dust. Hollis rode double with a young warrior, leaving his empty ranch behind to be swallowed by the desert. They traveled through terrain that would kill a novice, hidden canyons, dry riverbeds, paths that didn't exist on any map. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the Apache encampment, the sun was setting. It wasn't a war camp. It was a community. Smoke curled from cooking fires, children played in the dust, and the rhythm of life continued despite the threat looming on the horizon. Nahali led Halas to a small shelter. Ka, the older sister, was there waiting. She looked different now, up, armed, her eyes sharp. He wants to see you, she said to Halas, gesturing to the main tent. Inside, the younger sister Nadida lay recovering. She looked pale, but offered Halas a weak smile. It was there, in the dim light of the oil lamps, that the truth finally came out. They weren't just tracking us, Ka said, her voice hard. We saw something. A meeting. Men in suits, trading gold for land treaty. Illegal land treaties. They are planning to seize the valley. Not by law, but by slaughter. We are the witnesses. Halas felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't just a rescue mission. He had stumbled into a conspiracy that threatened to wipe out the entire tribe. That is why they hunt us, Nahali said, his presence filling the tent. And now, you are part of it. You are a witness to the witnesses. Suddenly, a shout erupted from outside. A sentry burst into the tent, breathless. Rydos, the sentry yelled. Northridge, 20 of them, heavily armed. Nahale's face hardened into granite. He grabbed his rifle. They found us, he growled. Halas stood up, the weight of the moment settling on him. He was a rancher, not a soldier. But as he looked at the sisters, and then at Nahali, he realized the choice he made yesterday was only the beginning. Give me a gun, Halas said. Nahali paused, looking at the white man who had saved his blood. He nodded once, a pact sealed in iron. He tossed Halas a rifle. Don't miss, the father said. They stepped out of the tent together as the first gunshot cracked through the canyon, echoing like the bell toll of a war that had just begun. The horizon was burning, and the enemy was at the gate. The first shot didn't sound like a crack. It sounded like the earth splitting open. Dirt exploded inches from Halas's boot, spraying gravel into his eyes. He didn't have time to think. Instinct, raw and primal, took the wheel. He threw himself behind a supply cart just as the air where he had been standing was occupied by lead. Beside him, Nahali moved with the terrifying calm of a man who had lived in the shadow of violence for decades. He didn't flinch, he calculated. He popped up, fired a single shot, and a rider on the ridge crumpled. Keep your head down, Nahali roared over the din. They are testing the perimeter. Halas gripped the rifle, his knuckles white. The canyon, moments ago a sanctuary, was now a kill box. Bullets ricocheted off the canyon walls, creating a cacophony of whines and thuds. Halas wasn't a soldier. He was a man who fixed fences and birthed calves. But as he looked across the camp, he saw the chaos mothers shielding children, elders scrambling for cover. He raised the rifle, rested the barrel on the wheel of the cart, and fired. The kick against his shoulder was a brutal reminder that he was alive. The attackers were organized. They moved in sweeping arcs, trying to flank the camp. But they hadn't counted on the ferocity of a father defending his blood. The Apache warriors fought back with lethal precision, turning the canyon's geography against the intruders. Amidst the smoke and dust, Halas saw movement near the infirmary tent, the place where Nadida lay unable to run. A figure was creeping low along the ground, avoiding the main firefight. It wasn't one of the riders. It was a man on foot, holding a long, serrated knife. A cleaner Halas didn't wait for orders. He broke cover. His lungs burned as he sprinted across the open ground. Bullets zipped past him like angry hornets, but his eyes were locked on the knifeman. Just as the intruder reached the tent flap, Halas hit him like a battering ram. They crashed into the dirt, a tangle of limbs in desperation. The knife skittered away, but the man was younger, faster. He landed a heavy blow to Halas's jaw that filled the rancher's vision with stars. Halas scrambled back, grasping for leverage, but the man was on him, hands closing around his throat. Halas's vision began to tunnel. The sounds of battle faded into a dull roar. Just as he thought his lungs would burst, a shadow fell over them. Chwack. The pressure on his throat vanished. The man slumped over, unconscious. Ka stood above them, the stock of her rifle still raised. She offered a hand to Halas, pulling him out of the dirt. You're either very brave or very stupid, she said, breath heaving. I'm learning, Halas gasped, wiping blood from his split lip. The gunfire tapered off as quickly as it had begun. The attackers, realizing they couldn't breach the defenses without heavy losses, pulled back to the ridge. But they didn't leave. They waited, a voice called out from the darkness. A man with a graying beard and a coat that looked too expensive for the frontier stepped into the moonlight at the canyon's edge. He held his hands up not in surrender, but in arrogance. Nah, the man shouted. We don't want a war with your people. Give us the girl and the rancher, and we ride away. Nahali stepped out into the open, a solitary figure against the dark rock. You come into my home, shoot at my family, and ask for favors? You will leave with nothing, but you're dead. The bearded man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about a horse. It isn't about pride. Those girls saw something they shouldn't have. And the rancher is a loose end. We're not just a posse, Nahali. We are the future. and you can't stop the future. He turned his horse. We'll be back at dawn, and we're bringing the cannon. The silence that followed was heavier than the battle. Inside the main tent, the mood was grim. The threat was clear. They had survived the probe, but they wouldn't survive the siege. What did you see? Hollis asked, looking at Nadita. Why are they willing to start a war for you? Nadita reached into the folds of her bandages and pulled out a leather pouch. From it, she extracted a piece of paper, folded and stained with sweat. She handed it to Hollis. It was a contract. Hollis moved it near the oil lamp. His eyes scanned the dense legal text, the government seals, the signatures of men he recognized from newspapers, powerful men, politicians, tycoons. It's a seizure order, Hollis whispered. They aren't just taking the land. They're fabricating a rebellion to justify a massacre. If this paper gets back to the capital, if the courts see this, it proves premeditated murder, Nahali finished. It proves they are orchestrating attacks to clear the territory for the railroad. That's why they can't let us live, Koss said. We are the evidence. Hollis looked at the paper, then at the faces around him. This was no longer about survival. It was about history. It was about justice. There is a federal marshal, Nah said, pointing to a map drawn in the dirt. Marshal Garrett Eas, in Redemption, 2 days' ride to the northeast. He is a hard man, but an honest one. If we get this paper to him, he will act. 2 deuce. Hollis shook his head. With the girl injured? With an army outside? We won't make it 10 miles. Nahali looked at Hollis, a glimmer of a plan forming in his eyes. We won't all make it, but the contract must. They moved under the cover of the moonless night. Now the whole camp, that'd be impossible. Just a small group. Nahali, his daughters, 2 of his best lieutenants, and Hollis. They slipped out through a narrow goat path at the back of the canyon, leading horses with wrapped hooves to silence their steps. They rode hard, putting miles between them and the camp before the sun threatened the horizon. But as dawn broke, casting long, pale shadows across the scrubland, the scout, Takakoto, rode back to them, his face grim. They found the tracks. Taka reported, they are coming. Fast, less than an hour behind. Hollis looked at Nadita. She was strapped to her horse, pale and sweating from pain. She couldn't gallop, not for long. If they stayed together, they would be caught. Nahali knew it too. He stopped his horse and turned to the group. We split up, Nahali said, his voice brooking no argument. Takakoto Kirikyu, take my daughters. Go north, through the riverbed. They will hide your tracks. Get them to Redemption. Father Noka protested. It is the only way. Nahali snapped. Then his voice softened. You carry the future? I will buy you time. He turned to Hollis. In your rancha? You have done your part. You can go south. Disappear. This is not your fight. Hollis looked at the contract in Nadita's saddlebag. He looked at the dust cloud rising in the distance, signaling the approaching death squad. He thought about his empty ranch, his empty life, and the feeling of the gun kicking against his shoulder, the feeling of fighting for something that actually mattered. They know I'm with you, Hollis said. If I go south, they'll know it's a trick. They're hunting a rancher and an Apache chief. Hollis rode his horse next to Nahali. You and me, we ride east. We make a lot of noise. We draw them away. Nah stared at him for a long moment, measuring the man's soul. You are walking into fire. Hollis vain. Hollis cracked a dry, weary smile. I never much liked the cold anyway. Nahali nodded. He took the contract from Nadita and handed it to Ride. He commanded, don't look back. Ask the daughters, and the warriors vanished into the riverbed. Hollis and Nahali turned their horses toward the rising sun and the open plain. They didn't hide. They didn't cover their tracks. They rode like madmen, kicking up a plume of dust that could be seen for miles. It worked. From the ridge, Hollis saw the pursuing force turn. The bearded man took the bait. The entire posse swiveled east, hungry for the kill, ignoring the subtle tracks leading north. They are following, Hollis shouted over the wind. Good, Nahali yelled back. Now we just have to stay alive long enough to make it count. They pushed the horses to their breaking point, the landscape blurring into streaks of brown and gold. But the pursuers were fresh, and they were closing the gap. Bullets began to zip past them, biting into the earth. Ahead, the terrain changed. The open plain gave way to a jagged labyrinth of rocks and slot canyons. When Nahali pointed to a narrow fissure in the rock wall, the Devil's Throat. We can hold them there. They drifted into the canyon, sliding off their heaving horses just as the main body of the enemy force came into view. It was a dead end for the horses, but a fortress. For 2 men with rifles? Hollis scrambled up the rocks, finding a perch. He checked his pockets. 6 bullets left. Nahali took the opposite side. He looked across the gap at Hollis. There were no speeches, no sentimental goodbyes. Just a nod of mutual respect between 2 men from different worlds, united by a singular, desperate purpose. The sound of 20 horses slowing to a halt echoed off the canyon walls. The bearded man's voice drifted up, confident and cruel. End of the line, gentlemen. Come down, and we'll make it quick. Hollis chambered around. The trap was set, now they just had to spring it. The sun was high now, baking the rocks of the Devil's Throat until they radiated heat like a furnace. The silence of the desert had been replaced by the deafening crack of rifle fire. Hollis Vane huddled behind a slab of sandstone, the air around him thick with the smell of sulfur and pulverized rock. He checked his rifle. The brass casing of his second-to-last bullet ejected with a metallic ping that sounded far too final. "One left," Hollis shouted across the gap. His voice was raspy, his throat coated in dust. Nahali, positioned on a ledge, 10 feet above, didn't look down. He was watching the canyon floor, his eyes scanning for shadows. "I have 2, the warrior replied, calm, as if discussing the weather. 3 bullets for 15 men. We must be careful." Below them, the bearded man whose name they would later learn was Silas Thorne, a land speculator with a soul as barren as the dirt he stood on, was losing patience. "You're dragging this out, Nahali," Thorne bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "And for what? A piece of paper? A rancher who doesn't even belong to you? He belongs to the land now?" Nahali yelled back. He fired a shot, forcing Thorne to scramble behind a boulder. "And the land protects its own." Hollis looked at the man above him. A week ago, he had been a hermit, waiting to die. Now, he was fighting a war alongside an Apache chief against a common enemy. It was absurd, it was terrifying, and it was the most alive he had felt in years. Thorne realized that words weren't working. He signaled his men, suppressing fire on the left, flank him on the right. "Go!" The canyon erupted. Bullets chipped away at Hollis's cover, forcing him to curl into a ball. He could hear boots crunching on gravel, getting closer. They were rushing the position. Hollis took a deep breath. He popped up, aimed at the lead runner, and squeezed the trigger. The man went down, clutching his leg. Click. Hollis stared at his rifle. Empty. He had missed, or maybe he'd dropped a round. It didn't matter. The weapon was now just a club. "Nahali," Hollis shouted. Mundra and Nahali looked down, his expression grim. He fired his last shot, dropping another attacker, then tossed his rifle aside. He drew a knife, a long, bone-handled blade that glinted in the sun. "Then we fight with what we have," Nahali said. He slid down the rocks to stand back to back with Hollis. 5 men were closing in, led by Thorne himself, who held a revolver with a confident smirk. "Brave," Thorne sneered, leveling his gun at Hollis's chest. "Stupid, but brave." Hollis tensed, ready to swing the rifle stock. He wasn't going to beg. He looked at Nahali, and the warrior nodded. A silent agreement. "We go outstanding." Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot never came. Instead, the sound rolled through the canyon, a deep, rhythmic drumming that vibrated in the soles of Hollis's boots. It wasn't thunder. It was horses. Many of them. Thorne's head snapped toward the canyon entrance. His smirk vanished. From the dust and the heat haze, riders emerged. But these weren't Thorne's reinforcements. They wore blue uniforms. The sun caught the glint of brass buttons and, more importantly, the silver star on the lead rider's chest. "Federal marshals," one of Thorne's men shouted, panic cracking his voice. Marshal Garrett rode like a man possessed, his revolver drawn. Behind him, flanked by deputies, rode Ka and Takakota. They hadn't gone to redemption. They had found the patrol on the road, cutting days off the journey. "Drop your weapons," Garrett's voice boomed, amplified by the canyon acoustics. "By order of the United States government." Thorne looked from the marshals to Nahali, then to his own men, who were already throwing their rifles into the dirt. The math had changed instantly. He was no longer a conqueror. He was a criminal caught in the act. Slowly, with a look of pure venom directed at Hollis, Thorne lowered his gun. The arrest was swift. Thorne and his surviving mercenaries were bound and marched out of the canyon. They can track the damn piece of paper that had started it. All was retrieved from Case's saddlebag and handed to Garrett. The marshal read it, his face darkening with every line. He looked up at Thorne, who was being hoisted onto a horse. "It's conspiracy. Attempted murder. Treason," Garrett listed, his tone icy. "You're going to hang, Silas. And the men who signed this with you, they'll rot in a cell." Hollis sat on a rock, his adrenaline crashing, leaving his hands shaking. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Nahali. The chief didn't say anything at first. He just offered Hollis a water disc and Hollis took it, the cool liquid washing away the dust of battle. "You said we wouldn't make it," Hollis said, a tired smile tugging at his lips. "I said we would by time," Nahali corrected, wiping soot from his forehead. "But I did not say we would die. That was an assumption you made." Rancha Ka walked over, leading the chestnut mare Hollis's horse, the one he had given away. "We met the marshal 10 miles out," she exclaimed, handing the reins to Hollis. "We told him everything. About the land, about the men." She looked Hollis in the eye. "And about the man who saved us." Hollis took the reins. The horse nuzzled his shoulder. Recognizing him? "You can go back now," Garrett said, walking over. "Your ranch is safe. With Thorne gone, the intimidation stops. You can rebuild." Hollis looked at the marshal. Then he looked at his hands. calloused and bloody. He looked at the empty horizon where his ranch stood, a monument to a solitary life he no longer recognized. Then he looked at Nahali, at Ka, at the warriors who were now sharing water and tending to wounds. He realized that the silence of his ranch terrified him more than the gunfire. "There's nothing there for me," Hala said quietly. "Just ghosts and dust." Nahali stepped forward. "Then come with us. The winter camp is high in the mountains. The air is clear, and we have many horses that need tending." "I'm not Apache," Hala said, the protest weak even to his own ears. "You bled with us," Nahali said, clapping a hand on Hollis's shoulder. "You fought for my daughters. You faced death for a truth that was not yours. Blood makes you related, Hollis Vane. Loyalty makes you kin. The West is full of stories about men who take, men who conquer, who fence off the horizon and call it. But this is a story about a man who gave." Hollis Vane never returned to his ranch. He let the wind reclaim the shack and the sand bury the fences. He rode north with Nahali, not as a guest, but as family. Years later, travelers in the high country would tell tales of a white man who lived among the Apache, a man who broke horses with a gentle touch and rode a chestnut mare that seemed to never age. They said he was a ghost, or a myth, but he wasn't a myth. He was just a man who had learned the hardest lesson of the frontier, that survival isn't about what you keep for yourself. It's about what you are willing to give away. Hollis Vane gave away his last horse at sunset, and in return, he was given a life worth living.